One man refuses to give up his seat, and this sets off a chain of events that will change the lives of hundreds. What began as a silent protest turns into a loud echo across the country. Behind the scenes, there is a fight not for a seat, but for the right to be seen and heard. But can the system change if at its heart are those who are afraid to look in the mirror? Don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss new stories. Terminal 5 at St. James Airport was particularly lively that evening. Business suits mingled with sneakers, the voice of the dispatcher with the clatter of suitcase wheels, and fatigue with the anticipation of something that was always about to happen. Grayson Marshall stood at the gate for Aurelia Air Flight 919, holding his e-ticket for seat 3A. He had arrived 10 minutes before boarding was announced, unhurried, unaccompanied, wearing an expensive but modest navy coat that made him look more like a philosophy professor than a man running a billion-dollar empire. He smiled at the gate agent and glanced around the empty business-class cabin. Seat 3A was his usual choice, the left row, the window, the second pair of seats, where the engine noise was quieter and the view was always a little nicer. He placed his laptop in the side compartment, put his phone in the armrest, and leaned back. He loved this feeling, the moment before takeoff, when the city was behind him and the sky hadn't yet begun. There was always room for silence. A few minutes later, she walked into the cabin, a woman in her mid-40s with sleek hair, pearl earrings, and the gait of someone who was used to doors opening before she raised her hand. Her suitcase was expensive, her perfume was insistent. She walked past the flight attendant, glanced quickly around the cabin, and stopped in front of Grayson. "Excuse me," she said, as if she had not expected to hear no in answer. "You seem to have taken my place." Grayson looked up, calmly, politely. He'd seen scenes like this before, just not with himself in the lead role. "Excuse me, ma'am, but this is my seat, 3rd A business class. No, you don't understand, I always sit here, always, in this place, even the flight attendants know." He frowned slightly, but the smile remained on his face. "Sorry, but I often fly this flight too, and I always sit here." The woman turned sharply to the flight attendant, who was watching them with several folders in her hands. "Sorry, but this is a misunderstanding. Please resolve it." The flight attendant glanced at her tablet, checked her seats, and nodded. "Yes, according to the list, seat 3A is assigned to Mr. Marshall." The woman threw up her hands. "But it's funny. I even had a conversation with the supervisor. I can't sit anywhere except 3A. It's a matter of principle." Grayson leaned forward slightly. "Sorry, ma'am, but this is not a matter of principle. This is a matter of order. You may have a wonderful place. It's just not this." The woman raised her eyebrows and hissed, "And who are you anyway?" He looked at her for a long time. There was no anger in his eyes, only weariness and firmness. "A person who has a ticket." Other passengers overheard the conversation. One of the men sitting in 3C even turned on his camera, unnoticed for now. The flight attendant glanced hesitantly at the shift supervisor who had just entered the cabin. "What's going on here?" The woman immediately began to speak loudly, almost with emotion. "This man took my seat. I said that I always sit here, and frankly, I don't feel very comfortable with the way he looks at me." It was said clearly. The emphasis was not accidental. The cabin grew quieter. Grayson did not move. The senior officer turned to him. "Sir, I understand this is unpleasant. Perhaps you could move. For the comfort of the passenger? I bought this seat, like everyone here. I don't move because someone just wanted my seat. Sorry." At this moment, the captain appears. The flight attendant whispers something to him. He approaches. "Mr. Marshall, I respect your position, but we cannot continue landing until this conflict is resolved. We cannot delay takeoff." Grayson rises, slowly, calmly, looks the captain in the eyes. "So decide. Just don't expect me to get up because someone said, I always sit here. I'm not in the way. I just don't disappear. Get used to it." The captain exchanges glances with the crew. A whisper. a ring. And 2 minutes later, airport security enters the cabin. Grayson is politely but firmly asked to leave. He takes the things without saying a word. He walks down the aisle slowly. Several people take pictures. Someone whispers, "He's right." Someone is silent. The woman sits down in his place as if she had won a battle she had started, and Grayson gets off the plane, alone, into the empty evening corridor of the terminal. He doesn't look back. He just takes out his phone and types a short message, "Stop the deal, right now." The recipient is his CFO. The company they were trying to save is Aurelia Air, and he's just made a decision that will cost them millions. But as he knows, there are more valuable things, and sometimes it's just a place where you have a right to stay. Outside, the evening was deceptively quiet. The sun's rays had already disappeared over the horizon, leaving only a dim glow, and the glass walls of the terminal reflected it, as if they were still clinging to the passing day. Grayson Marshall walked into the waiting area without quickening his pace. He didn't glance around, didn't seek support, didn't curse or make excuses. He just walked, calmly, like a man who hadn't allowed himself to be crossed off. Not from the list. Not from the plane. Not from his dignity. He stopped at the information desk, opened his phone, and typed a message. "Paul, cancel the signing with Aurelia, temporarily. I'll be in touch in a couple of hours." "Gee." The answer came almost instantly. "You are sure?" He didn't answer. He simply locked the screen and walked over to the panoramic window. From there, he could clearly see the plane he'd just been rescued from rolling out onto the runway. Its number, 919, was bright on its tail. He didn't feel angry or humiliated, more like a strange emptiness, all too familiar, like the one he'd felt as a child when his teacher in class didn't notice his raised hand, when a security guard at a department store watched him between the shelves, when colleagues at meetings repeated his ideas as if they were their own. Only now, everything was different. He was rich, influential, famous. And still, it wasn't enough to keep him in his chair. He sat down on the leather couch in the empty room and closed his eyes. His breathing became even, but a storm was brewing inside. He remembered the woman's face, cold, confident in her own rightness to the point of being ridiculous. He remembered the stewardess who didn't even try to defend the client, just nodded as if everything was predetermined. He remembered the captain's voice, even polite but with a hint of impatience, as if the very fact of disagreement was already a violation of order. Grayson knew. They did not see him as a threat. They simply did not see him as an equal. And that was the biggest threat. Meanwhile, on board Flight 919, passengers were beginning to whisper. The man in seat 3C, the one who had filmed on his phone, had already posted the video online. The caption was simple. He had a ticket. She had a privilege waiting. Guess who stayed in her seat? The video was rapidly gaining views. Comments were divided into two camps, but most agreed on one thing. Something about this story went way beyond boarding. Meanwhile, back at Neural Core Systems, Grayson's assistant Vivian looked up from her screen as her computer beeped softly. She opened her internal notification system and saw the command, "Freeze communications with Aurelia. Protocol C." She froze. That meant a deal worth millions of dollars, 6 months in the making, was on hold. No explanation. Only Grayson had the authority to activate such a protocol, and if he did, something serious had happened. While everyone was guessing, Grayson was already in the car, not a limo, not a driver, but a regular taxi, ordered through an app. He asked to be taken not to his home, not to a hotel, but to an old house on the outskirts of town, where no one knew his name. The house had been in his family since the 1950s. His father, a carpenter, had built it with his own hands. It was a place with no titles, just walls smelling of wood and a rocking chair on the porch. There, Among the chirping of spring birds and the clinking of a glass door, Grayson felt who he really was again. No tie. No deals. He turned on the TV, no sound. The news was on the screen, and as he expected, the headlines were already showing the video from inside Flight 919. His face, her face. The caption, another airline incident. The role of race and status in the skies. He turned off the sound but not the screen. He just watched. Behind him, the wind stirred the curtains. Night was falling slowly. Later, closer to midnight, he received a call from Paul, the CFO. "You know it's going to blow up, right? They've figured it out. They're already calling. The board is panicking." "Great," Grayson replied calmly. "Do you want revenge?" He fell silent. Then he said, "I don't want this to happen again. Not to me. Not to anyone who doesn't have $1 billion to make a name for themselves." Paul exhaled. "Then what are you planning?" Grayson stood up and paced the room. His steps were even. He looked at his hands, strong and straight. The same ones that had once held a hammer next to his father and now controlled hundreds of employees. Not to take revenge, but to transform. But they won't start. We will start. He hung up. The road was noisy outside, and in his chest, a plan was already forming. Not revenge, a mechanism, not a scream, a structure. Because sometimes, to change a system, you don't have to hit it. You have to show how it can be better, and start with yourself. The morning began with headlines. First-class passenger removed from flight for refusing to give up seat. Aurelia Air incident, racism, or misunderstanding. Grayson Marshall. When silence becomes louder than words. Overnight, a short clip from Flight 919 had been shared across all platforms. The video shows a short but sharp scene. A woman points to her supposedly usual seat. A man politely refuses. Security comes in and takes him away. But it wasn't about the words. People felt there was a whole story behind it. Pain, accumulated over centuries, breaking out in another give up. In the office of Neural Core Systems, the phones were ringing. Partners, investors, journalists, all wanted one thing, comment, but there was none. Vivian, Grayson's assistant, gave a formulaic answer. "Mr. Marshall is currently unavailable for communication." And yet, inside her, there was a growing sense that this story went beyond corporate strategy. Because everyone who worked with him knew Grayson was not a man of flashy actions. He did not play to the crowd. If he started something, there was a purpose behind it, built like architecture, with calculation, weight, and foundation. By mid-afternoon, Aurelia Air had issued a short statement. "We regret the misunderstanding that occurred on board Flight 919. The company is conducting an internal investigation. All employees complied with the regulations." People online exploded. Comments under the post were divided into hundreds of thousands. A misunderstanding is forgetting a toothbrush, not pulling a person out of a seat. They still don't understand who they're trying to push. Grayson's name no longer sounded like the name of a tech mogul. It had become a symbol, and no one controlled that symbol anymore. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, panic was setting in. The board of directors had convened for an emergency meeting. Chris Whalen, the CEO, tapped his pen nervously on the glass table as he scanned the charts. The stock was falling. He had already realized that Marshall was more than just a name. He was a potential investor, the man with whom they were discussing a strategic alliance to save the company from bankruptcy. Now this man was their worst nightmare. And worst of all, he was silent. While everyone was discussing crisis response strategy, Grayson was on the other side of town, in a coffee shop tucked into the courtyard of an old building. No one knew him there. He sat at a corner table with a black legal pad. On the blank page was one word: system. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about changing a structure that allowed people to be pushed out of their seats, not because they weren't entitled, but because someone else had a different idea of privilege. He started writing. The pages came quickly. a training program, a module on empathy, personalized flight simulations, nonverbal pressure analysis, feedback from passengers from different communities. The concept was called Skyline Second because everyone deserves a second chance, even those who made mistakes. By evening, Grayson had given an interview, not to a TV station, not to a newspaper. He posted a video to his account with a plain background. The camera was looking straight at his face, no makeup, no effect. I don't want people to remember my name. Remember the moment when someone refused to give up, not a chair, but the right to be themselves. I don't blame people. I blame a culture where silence is considered a convenience, and power is a shadow for which there is no need to apologize. I don't go to court. I go constructive, and I start with myself. The video got 17 million views in a day. People wrote, "He didn't break the system, he put a mirror in it." Grayson is not a hero. He is the voice of all those who once were silent. The next day, Aurelia fired the flight attendant who had started the conflict, then the supervisor, then the captain. But instead of a sense of satisfaction, a new wave of discussions arose in society. What to do with the fired? What to do with the system that created them? And then Grayson took the next step. He announced that he was offering a retraining program to all three. Not for their sake, to prove that even in a mistake, there is a path to growth. The idea divided the community. Some said, spinelessness. Others, the ultimate in leadership. And the flight's former captain, Matt Henderson, gave his first interview. He said, "I didn't realize what I had done until I saw my son's eyes." He showed me the video and said, "Dad, that's not you. Or are you like this now?" I don't want to stay like this. Grayson watched the interview without stopping. Then he closed his laptop. The rain was pouring outside. And in its silence, he realized, everything is going well. Because if even one person is ready to reconsider not their place in the chair, but their position in life, then it's worth continuing. The silence that followed the storm was almost more disturbing than the storm itself. The scandal surrounding Flight 919 had begun to give way to new news, but Grayson Marshall's name continued to resonate, not as the hero of the moment, but as an agent of change. He didn't disappear after the video, or become a symbol of fleeting indignation. He stayed, and he began to build something that lived beyond the headlines. The Skyline Second program he announced just a week ago was already accepting applications. People, fired, humiliated, ashamed of their actions, were writing letters, not for compensation, for fixing. One of the first to respond was the flight captain, Matt Henderson. His letter was short. "I didn't understand that I stood for fear, not rules. I want to understand. I want to retrain, not for the position, for my son." Grayson read it 3 times. Each word was filled with guilt and a desire for change. He called Vivian and told her to prepare the first training session. But this was not a training in the traditional sense, not a lecture, not a list of how not to be a racist. This was a personal dialogue, face to face, where there was no longer any hiding behind a form, a regulation, a title. The first class took place in a small room in a building that had once housed a printing press. Exposed brick walls, natural light, a circle of chairs. The participants included not only former Aurelia employees, but also people from other industries, HR managers, police officers, teachers, those who wanted to learn not to defend themselves, but to listen. Grayson sat in the center of the circle, not with a presentation, with a notepad and a cup of water. He started like this. "I am not an expert on tolerance. I am not a professor of justice. I am simply a man who was once told that his place was not his, and who decided not to leave. Today, I do not want to give you answers. I want us to ask the right questions together." At first, there was tension. People were afraid to speak. They were afraid not of those around them, but of those inside themselves. But gradually, the ice broke. One of the participants, Sandra, admitted, "I always thought I was just asking politely. that it wasn't my fault if someone felt different. But now I understand that politeness without awareness is just another language of pressure. Some nodded. Some looked away. Matt, the captain, was silent for a long moment, then said, "I didn't see a person. I saw a situation that needed to be sorted out. And that was my mistake. I chose silence over justice, because it's easier that way." Grayson listened. He didn't interrupt. He just wrote down the words that were being said. After the session, he approached Matt. "You are not the first one who was silent, but now you are one of those who speaks. This is already a step." At the same time, a transformation was underway within Aurelia Air. The board realized that apologies would not save the situation. Real action was needed. A new unit was created, the Ethics and Equality Department. For the first time in the company's history, an outsider was invited to lead it. That person was Malin Sato, a human rights activist with experience in transforming corporate cultures. She met Grayson in a neutral setting, a small tea room on Broome Street. No press, no cameras. "Why didn't you destroy us?" she asked bluntly. "You could have. Reputationally, financially, legally, but you chose retraining." "Why?" Grayson looked at her calmly. "Because it is not monsters that work in this system. It is people. And if people are ready to change, that is more important than victories." "But what if they didn't want to?" He chuckled. "Then I wouldn't have offered them my hand. I would have raised it higher." Their conversation marked the beginning of a collaboration. Skyline 2nd became part of the mandatory training for all new Aurelia employees. It was also adapted for use in other partner companies. Grayson himself received offers to consult at the government level, but has so far declined. He didn't want to be a banner. He wanted to be an action. While society was arguing whether to forgive those who stumbled or punish them forever, he did what seemed to him the only right thing. He created a bridge. Not from excuses, but from intentions, and people began to walk across this bridge. One evening, he was sitting at home. On the table was a box of letters. Real ones. From strangers. Someone had written, "After your story, I wasn't afraid to stand up for the girl who was being pushed off the bus." Someone else had written, "For the first time, I recognized that I worked in a culture of fear and called it order." Someone had simply sent a postcard that said, "Thank you for staying in your place. You allowed me to believe that mine matters too." Grayson read it all and set the box aside. He knew the journey had just begun. More difficult conversations, more unpopular decisions, more resistance. But now he had a team. Listeners. People who chose growth over comfort. Sometimes revolution doesn't thunder. It sounds like silence, like a person who doesn't give up his seat, not out of stubbornness, but out of the right to be. 6 months passed. The city outside the window lived its usual life. Cars rushed along the avenues, billboards replaced each other, passengers again lined up to board. But something had changed. Aurelia Air flights no longer had a creaky, indifferent voice coming from the speakers. Instead, passengers were greeted by name, without feigned politeness, but with genuine attention. New employees were trained according to a program that was not advertised in newspapers or extolled at conferences, but which everyone who had once seen a short video knew about. People simply called it among themselves, the Marshall Program. In the international terminal's waiting room, at a table by the window, sat a young employee in an Aurelia uniform. His name tag read Oliver Ray. Next to him was a folder of documents and a clipboard on which he was writing something. In front of him sat a new intern, nervously stroking the rim of a paper cup of coffee. "Were you really on that flight?" the intern asked, his eyes shining like someone who had heard a legend and wanted to make sure it was real. Oliver chuckled, leaned back in his chair and said, "I wasn't the only one there. I was standing in the aisle when it happened. I heard him say, 'I'm just a guy with a ticket.' And how his gaze didn't waver, even when security came for him. I thought then, he's going to lose. And now I understand. He won because he didn't give himself up, not even for being polite. The intern remained silent, as if afraid to spoil the silence. Then he said, "And did you see him after?" Oliver shook his head. "Personally, no. But, frankly, he's in everything we do now. He's changed more than just procedures. He's changed the way we look at each other, and that's much more important." At that moment, Grayson Marshall was far from the terminal. He was standing on the shore of a lake in a small town outside Savannah. He held a thin notebook in his hands, a gift from one of the students who had attended his recent lecture on leadership through empathy. On the cover was a quote, "Power is not in the volume of your voice, but in the firmness with which you remain where you are." He smiled, not out of pride, but out of a sense that his voice had not been lost in the noise. He ran his fingers over the paper, inhaled slowly, and looked out at the calm surface of the water. He spoke less often now. He spoke selectively. He refused publicity when he felt that people were seeking him not for the sake of meaning, but for the sake of sensation. But the letters kept coming. One of the recent envelopes had no return address. Inside was only one thing, a photograph of an old window seat in business class, on the back of which lay a card, "Reserved for those who are not afraid to stay." He returned home late in the afternoon. Vivian was waiting for him with a printed report. Partner companies wishing to implement Skyline's second were now compiling a separate register. Among them were not only airlines, but also railroads, banks, even large government agencies. Everyone wanted to learn to speak not only by the book, but like a human being. He leafed through the list and sighed. It was more than he expected, and still not all. "Do you think we should expand the team?" Vivian asked. "I think we should make it so that the team doesn't depend on me," he replied. She nodded, because she understood. His mission was not to be the center, but to be the impulse. Late that evening, Grayson walked out onto the terrace. The first stars were already twinkling in the sky. He looked up, thinking of that flight, 919, as a coordinate, as a point on the map where one man made a choice, and from it a movement was born. Not political, not commercial, but human. His phone lit up, a new message, from Captain Matt Henderson, a photo of him, smiling, wearing a new uniform with the Skyline program emblem. The caption, "Gave my first lecture to new pilots today. Thanks for not giving up on me then." Grayson simply replied, "Thanks for going the distance." He turned off the screen and looked at the sky again. There were no planes, only light and silence. The same silence that once fell on the plane and now has become a symbol of change. The silence in which important decisions are born, where you no longer need to shout to be heard, where it is enough to just stay in your place. And let this place become the beginning of something bigger.